There are a lot of tutorials on how to tempo map in Reaper, but I have to say I've not been too thrilled about any of the workflows that I've seen so far. Most of them assume that the cue is largely performed to a click, with very few tempo adjustments in general. Some of them assume there's a clear percussive line in the track so that you can detect based on transients, or maybe clear visual cues in the waveform. But what do you do when you have a rubato orchestral piece where there's really no clear transients, the tempo is kind of shifting, there's a lot of accelerando, rallentando, pieces in general played rubato, so you're doing a lot of micro adjustments to the tempo map. What's the most ideal workflow for that? So I'd like to share the workflow that I use for tempo mapping those types of tracks. And I'll show you a piece from a recent transcription exercise that is exactly that type of track. So before we get going, there's a few actions that you're going to need to know about. The first one is to enable spectral peaks. I find that although there's no transients that help in identifying the tempo map, spectral information is often quite useful. So the action is toggle spectral peaks. If yours is off, you can turn that on. The next one is from the SWS extension, play pause from mouse cursor position. The next one is also from the SWS extension, move closest grid line to mouse cursor, perform until shortcut is released. And then in order to control how the items respond to tempo changes, you're going to need to modify the time base. The first one is setting the item time base to time, where it will stay constant or consistent with respect to time and ignore tempo changes. And the other one is to set it to beats, position length rate, in which case it will stretch and compress according to the tempo. For purposes of creating a tempo map for a recorded piece, you want to set the item's time base to time. Now, I recently picked up a handy little device called a Stream Deck, and I've created a folder for various actions needed for tempo mapping, like the ones that I showed you, plus a few others like undo and delete and things like that. You can see that here. The ones that I showed you are grid to mouse and the play pause for mouse cursor position. And then these here affect the time base to either respect the tempo or ignore the tempo accordingly. So I'm going to show you my workflow based on these actions for tempo mapping this piece. Generally, I start with creating an overall project BPM. And for this one, having already listened to it, it's somewhere in and around 45. So I set the first tempo marker to 45. And then I listen to the piece and go through measure by measure and drop the tempo markers so that they land on the measure. And then I go back over each measure and finesse the quarter notes or whatever is needed for a more fine tempo map. So I'm going to go through that now based on measures, and hopefully it's not too tedious. But first I'm going to show you the undo history window so that you can see specifically which actions I'm performing. We're going to need to clear the click. Yeah, you can hear those last two measures that I did from bars 6 and 7 are very rubato. So rather than doing the whole thing, of course, I'm just going to go back over now and show the previous measures. I forgot to drop a tempo marker on that first beat, which I should have done. And we're just going to listen through, and I'm going to do now fine adjustments and readjust the measures, just make sure everything's lining up. Sometimes these can be a little slippery. So it's way over here. This one's not right. So that's good enough, and you get the idea how you would do the remainder of the track. So now that the tempo map is laid down, if I wanted to import something that I had created from a notation program, they should generally line up. Now let's pull those in. And so there, you get the idea. This is how you would do the entire track and track each of these fine tempo adjustments. You can see quite a number of them, and some of them pretty extreme as well, you know, as you would expect from a very human orchestral performance. Okay, there's just one more thing I wanted to cover, and that's creating a tempo map for MIDI. If you've made a recording from your MIDI controller and you want to create a tempo map from that performance, it works much in the same way as the audio item we showed before. But the difference is the way that the MIDI items handle time base. So here you can see if I make a change to the tempo, the MIDI item at the bottom is stretching and compressing, which is much the same way that the audio item would work when the time base is set to beats while preserving rate. Unfortunately, changing time base to time on the MIDI item doesn't have the same effect. For that, we need to use the SWS action ignore project tempo for selected MIDI items, preserving time position of MIDI events. So if we execute that, and then make the change to the tempo, here you can see that that bottom MIDI item isn't actually stretching and compressing anymore. whereas these ones are because I haven't made that change. So for that bottom MIDI item, when you've recorded a performance that you want to create a tempo map from, you would use that ignore project tempo on those items. But for these items here, which I've imported from a notation editor where the notes are aligned to a beat, for that you would want those to stretch and compress because you're modifying the performance. Okay, hopefully that was helpful.